Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're very happy to have our distinguished speaker today for this very interesting lecture. So we all know Professor Han Junya. We're so excited and so happy when you see her. She is, for those who see her for the first time, some new students, she is Associate Dean for Research of the Faculty of Arts and Associate Head and Associate Professor of Department of Translation, Interpreting and Intercultural Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University. And her other roles include co-editor of Journal of Global South and a review editor of the Interpreter and Translator Trainer. She's also president of the Hong Kong Translation Society and founder of Antilink. Dr. Pan's research interests include corpus-based interpreting translation studies, political discourse and translation interpreting learners, factor in interpreting training, and professionalism in interpreting. Today, this topic is actually very relevant, very interesting. But constructive markers in interpreted and non-interpreted policies, which is right. And now we're looking at that. Well, this is highly relevant, and it's really also very relevant the next step of our training. Well, let's put our hands together. Welcome, Professor
Thank you very much, Professor Lei. I thank you very much, especially for the hospitality and very nice introduction. And I always enjoy visiting Macau, making me feel a little bit like coming back home. And the students here are very, very passionate, and really enjoyed communicating with you. But thank you very much again for the invitation. So today, the topic, I'm going to try to make it slightly less technical, but I think as Professor Lei mentioned, this may be very, very relevant to the practice of interpreting itself, because I'm not sure how many of you might produce repetitive words and verbs in your speech when you're especially interpreting from English into Chinese into English in political settings. Do you dare to say but at all? Even though you hear the word but in Putonghua Cantonese, do you dare to really render it into but? Or would you choose something more, less offensive, or use some strategies in between? So those are the kinds of things that we may wonder, especially when we started doing interpreting. So today I hope to be able to bring you some research data from a corpus-based point of view to help you to support your ideas and strategies in your daily practice of interpreting, especially if you are under the constraint of certain kind of production pressure, especially in political settings. So we have to be able to answer a few questions in relevance to that matter. But before we start, something relevant to the theory itself. We know that interpreting, especially the kind of political scenario where it may pose extra layers of pressure on both the speakers and the interpreters themselves. Theoretically speaking, political speeches and political interpreting constitute two special types of spoken discourse in political settings, and they are delivered under different constraints. But at the same time, they form indispensable parts of the political discourse, which means that it's involved not just itself as interpreting or speech per se, but is part of a bigger discourse, which is what we may call a political discourse. So among the various features of political speeches, there are issues of what we may call, again, very theoretical at this stage, but I hope to be able to unpack the theoretical framework a little bit in the next slide. But definitely in political speeches, there are issues of what we may call representativeness and section, or authority and acceptability, because those terms and the theory concepts are believed to be closely relevant to their pragmatic meaning, and those are the kind of daily struggles interpreters working in political settings are struggling with. So what are representativeness and section? I'm borrowing the framework of political speech in this regard, and scholars such as Emsink specified political speeches were supposed to be authorized, acceptable, and able to win the favor of the public. Think about the kind of government policy speeches and the kind of politician talks. They are in a way supposed to be authorized to a certain way to be able to win public support, as mentioned here. We also have other scholars, including Sauer, expressed similar views, believing that orators, speakers of political speeches were public persons. So they are public persons, which means that their speeches had to be representative of the government itself. The second concept we hope to develop to unpack here is what we call sanction. So this is not so easy to unpack, but if you think about political speeches receiving growing public exposure, which is relevant to representativeness, to a certain extent is receiving public censorship, and in that way it translates into what we may call sanction in this regard. In this entire formation of political speeches, translation itself, although often invisible in the field of politics, is actually an integral part of political activity, which helps to add another layer of sanction to the entire activity of delivering and interpreting political speeches. We will try to link back to the terms of the later, just bearing in mind that political speeches and political interpreting in particular should be, first of all, representative, and secondly, it is under public sanction to a certain extent. Are we okay so far? So, in this regard, when we talk about interpreting, particularly simultaneous interpreting, as many of you are practicing at the moment, has been regarded as a kind of constrained mode of translation in aspects such as we know that in simultaneous interpreting you have the constraint of time, short-term memory capacity, and knowledge. If you don't know enough about the subject that you are interpreting about, then you will encounter more difficulties. So theoretically, interpreting is placed in a contour, in a kind of spectrum of constrained language varieties, and to my understanding, it is the most difficult, most constrained language in a variety of constrained languages, including speech delivered, like for example, I'm delivering a speech on a constrained mode because as compared to murmuring to myself and encountering the kind of pressure from you because of your already being made. But when you're doing interpreting, then you are under the constraint of more factors, including short-term memory and knowledge itself. So this kind of constraints are usually complicated by the originally sensitive nature and setting of political meetings, because the very setting of actually this room, the kind of formality of the room sometimes can add the layer of constraints to the language production itself. And students need to be trained in such a room so that they can get adapted to official settings when we're doing real simultaneous work at the room. But in political setting, it's even more terrifying because you will have people all sitting up, cameras looking at you, and you will be put in the spotlight sometimes, and then you are under more constraints as compared to the normal way of doing interpreting. Therefore, in this case, it makes the study of political interpreting even more interesting because there are so many, the interpreting itself carries what we may call pragmatic significance because you are helping people to communicate with each other, and your communication can create certain impact. If you translate anything wrong on spot, then you may cause a war between two states. And in history, things like that happened. Therefore, it is very, very important for us to really think about the pragmatic significance of your interpreting, and you have to be pragmatically adaptive to the kind of pressure and constraints posed to you. Most importantly, we know that language is not just the surface of the word itself. You have to convey what we call the meaning, the message, and most importantly, the underlying attitude is the most difficult for you to think about, not to mention interpreting at all. So you have to guess what kind of attitude is carried by the original speaker, especially when politicians, they usually use a monotus term to carry out whatever meaning they want you to carry. So those kind of delicacies in the daily practice of communicating in the political interpreting itself makes it so interesting and such an interesting subject for study. Now we're going to move on to another very important term associated to the study, contrastive markers. So what are contrastive markers? Its official definition is that contrastive markers refer to the linguistically encoded clues which signal the speaker's potential communicative intentions. Think about attitude. Just now we talked about the surface meaning, the word meaning, and we also need to carry out the subtle meaning or the implied meaning, which is the attitude. So contrastive markers here, in this sense, carries best the kind of linguistic clue that we can study about in order to help us to understand what might be the actual communicative intention, the attitude underlying the message itself. So if we don't know this very big term, contrastive marker, then you definitely know the kind of instances listed here, including however, but, on the contrary, those are the words indicating what we may call contrastive markers. The usage of contrastive markers usually signal that the utterance following is either a denial or a contrast of some proposition associated with the preceding discourse. So basically, you're saying something denying the previous sentence, the meaning of the previous sentence. Or sometimes it's contrary to your own expectation, or a third case, a negative cohesion relation. They can even indicate the unexpected, surprising nature of what is being said in view of what was said before. So part of the reason why we wanted to devote our attention to contrastive markers because it implies the kind of meaning, the kind of attitude. What is more interesting is that it implies a meaning twist, the implied attitude twist in between the preposition before and after. And then that poses strong interest among researchers in this field. In our previous studies, we find that among all the different types of contrastive markers under study, but and however constitute the two most frequently used CMs, contrastive markers in critical speeches in English, and also in interpretive policy speeches in English in particular. And they correspond very neatly to what we may call buckball and banpei. Actually, buckball is more, I would say, is closer to however, and banpei is comparable to but, stronger, slightly stronger. And according to their dictionary meaning, they correspond closely to what we may call however and but as well. But what is interesting, again, I'm using but now to be very helpful. The very use of the wording but and however implies a certain kind of attitude, a certain kind of communicative intention, how much you want to relate your previous discourse or proposition in the previous discourse. And what is interesting, again, is because the kind of subtleness in the usage of but and however can differ. And they suggest a certain kind of stronger terms of meaning, stronger sense of meaning, or slightly lighter sense of meaning. So but is regarded usually as a little bit stronger than however in areas of denial of expectation and contrast, whilst however is more like concession, however, and conceit, and the closing of a topic or reintroduction of a prior topic, which is more subtle than but in many aspects. So if you want to play, say, perhaps in between but and however, I don't know your choice, but perhaps especially in political setting, you would want to choose one of them, but let's look at how professional interpreters choose those settings. So I have gone through the introduction of the usage of but and however. Again, in our previous studies, we find the usage of but and however among all of the pragmatic markers, which indicates general attitudes, not just about denial or contrast of meaning. The usage of but and however were treated especially interestingly in different patterns by politicians and interpreters of them. We found that in previous studies there is a certain level of mitigation used by interpreters by applying more usage of varieties of translation for the very word banpei, which should correspond to but has been interpreted into many other varieties, including however instead of but itself. So we found this very, very important and also understudied area quite interesting. But if we look into the general research of interpreting in previous research, we found quite conflicting results. For example, body of music found a general mitigating effect on the pronoun directness and most importantly on improductiveness in the case of conference interpreting. So mitigating identified by one of the previous researchers, but another series studies conducted by Nuno and Tang suggested that there is a particular explicitation effect that can be identified in interpreted speeches, especially in consecutive interpreting. So this suggested that because on one hand it's mitigating, on the other hand, we want to make the original attitude more specific, more explicit. Therefore, it suggested that in some of the research, then it means that you have to resort to use however instead of but some other research suggested that you need to use but. But what to use? Those are very practical questions that we want to ask ourselves, and also in our training, we want to teach our students what to do. So that inspired us to look into the very big questions in this study, how attitudes are communicated, especially through the concrete usage of contrastive markers as mentioned earlier. Very interesting areas of study, but still received very conflicting results. We don't know which is right, which is wrong, so we wanted to see how people, especially interpreters and politicians, may use contrastive markers differently. And most importantly, we want to think about the kind of settings. For example, when you are delivering a monologue, like I'm doing now, then I have to use formal language. So what kind of choices will you make? And when I'm entering into the Q&A session later, then it's more like communicative, and then I have to be able to use an informal tone. So what kind of language choices should I use? So those are the kind of different types of settings and parameters that we want to take into consideration when we conduct a piece of research work. In more specific ways, in this study, we're looking into 4 different research questions, and we're going to go through them one by one. So I actually reorganized the findings to make them match the original data so that we can discuss them one by one before we forget everything. So question number 1, we hope to be able to find out the differences, if any, in the frequency of the 2 CX, however, but in policy speeches interpreted from Chinese to English and those delivered in English. Number 2, we hope to be able to find out the kind of differences, if any, in the corpus of the 2 CX, in those interpreted from Chinese to English and again delivered in English. Number 3, we wanted to look at the frequency first, and then the collocates of the CNs to find out how they may vary if there is a variance at all in monologue mode as compared to those delivered in a dialogue mode. In order to find it out, we would like to resort to existing data, and in the previous presentation I talked about the CEPIC, so I won't give you more details here, but here's the QR code which can lead you directly to the CEPIC corpus, which is with the full name, the Chinese English Political Interpreting Corpus, and 6.5 million open access corpus that can be used by researchers and MA students who are interested in doing research. So we used the CEPIC as the source of data because it gathers interpreting data from top events like government reports, policy speeches, those high-level events. And what is important is that it reflects all professional interpreters' performance in those very sensitive political settings. So we selected 2 subcorpora from the CEPIC data, and they are listed here. And I have further divided them into 2 subcorpora. What is called CEPIC actually means the corpus of interpreted political speeches from Chinese to English. What is called SEPS here, sorry for the acronyms, actually refers to the corpus of English politician speeches. So CEPIC refers to interpreted English, in simple words, in political settings. SEPS refers to politician speeches in English. So native speakers' English production versus interpreters' output in English. And then they can be further divided into the PRC subcorpus and the Hong Kong subcorpus. And the sets can be further divided into the UK and US subcorpus. For the clarity of the data presentation, we can look at the last row, which is STTR, that offers a kind of comparison between datasets in a standardized way, because you can see the datasets or corpora actually are composed of different word numbers. Therefore, if we look at the STTR, which indicates the kind of lexical variety level of those corpora, those subcorpora, then we can compare and then find out among all of the English corpora, subcorpora that we used in the study, the PRC English subcorpus seem to have the highest level of STTR, indicating a high level of lexical variety as compared to even the original speakers corpus, indicating interpreters use more various words, collection of words, as compared to the native speakers of politicians. And then if we divide them further into monologues and dialogues, so we have M standing for monologue and D standing for dialogue, then we can see that for the STTR again, in the monologues column, we have higher STTR levels, indicating monologues feature higher level of lexical variety as compared to dialogues. And the situation, the kind of comparison between CEPIC and sets, interpreted speech versus native English speaker speech, we find again, interpreters, especially those who are working for monologues, they seem to have a high level of lexical variety as compared to the native speakers' production, which is quite interesting again. So the kind of basic statistics offer us a general landscape of the data at hand, and then when we zoom in to look at actual distribution or the actual findings relating to the two scans, we can generate more interesting results. So let's look at the first research question. What are the differences, if any, in the frequency of the two CMs, however and but, in policy speeches interpreted from Chinese to English and those delivered in English? Those are again the basic data statistics relating to the findings of the usage of not just the English but also the Chinese originals, which are placed here for comparison purposes. But let's look at English versions of however and but in interpreted English on the left, sets native speakers English on the right. And again, I listed some past statistics here, but in order to understand it quickly, let's look at the average frequency. Because if you look at total frequency, it doesn't speak much because the data sets are different size. But if we look at average frequency, we can find that we have more average frequency, a higher level of average frequency of however as compared to in interpreted speech as compared to the native speaker's speech. But if you look at the case of but, you can see in native speaker speech there is obviously a much higher level of usage of but as compared to the interpreters. Meaning what? Meaning politicians are there to say but interpreters sometimes will resort to other kind of strategies to express the very meaning of but. So let's unpack the finding in regard to research question number 1 here. So the findings here identified a completely different use patterns of the two CMs. So a higher frequency of however in the interpreted policy speeches, but a much lower frequency of but than the non-interpreted those ones did. And the statistic difference was more significant in the case of but. So again, this suggests a possible tendency of mediation in interpreted speech, and this kind of hypothesis is more or less confirmed as compared to the previous pilot study with a larger data set and also more varieties of speech. So the question is, If explicitation is a political act of interpreters, mitigation may be deemed a preferred interpreting strategy or political choice employed by interpreters working in highly sensitive political arenas as possible practice of interpreting norm and self-censorship. Meaning that interpreters, when doing, especially conference interpreters in a political setting, may resort to certain kind of self-censorship to resort to the less offensive usage of a contrastive marker by resorting to more, however, than rushing the interpretation. At a macro level, mitigation may then be considered associated with issues of sanction or acceptability, both of them, to a certain degree. Of course, when we unpack the findings, we still have to take into consideration the kind of data. It's like when we talk about ChatGPT nowadays, we think about not just what ChatGPT can produce, but most importantly, the kind of data has been fed into it. So the kind of data that has been fed into this piece of research is that we are talking about Chinese to English in a ritual mode because that's the data that we fed into the kind of analysis that we have presented to you just now. So basically, all of the findings that we have spotted are relevant and may be constrained to ritual interpreting. And this applies to, most importantly, to Chinese to English interpreting in particular. And this kind of ritual mode, because you're interpreting not into an A language, but actually your B language. So on top of the usual constraints of time, short-term memory capacity, and knowledge in interpreting, this may add as a third or even fourth layer of dimensional constraint into the interpreter's mind. And of course, in political setting, we have the extra pragmatic constraints imposed by the high-profile political setting itself, and then the interpreters were situated in those kind of constraints, and the findings should be unpacked with even more care, because they are such kind of findings are generated on data produced in an extreme scenario. Of course, we have those results. We don't rule out a possible influence of cross-cultural communication constraints as well, because we talked about Chinese to English interpreting in particular, and also the two CMs may in nature situated in two very different language contexts. Meaning, in Chinese, perhaps we tend to use more softened contrastive markers as compared to a stronger version of it. This teaches us that when we read the findings even of our own research, we may have to unpack it with care to think about where the data comes from and what kind of constraints it may bring to the very interpretation of the data. Now we're going to move on to question number 2. What are the differences, if any, in the top 4 case of the two CMs in policy speeches interpreted from Chinese to English and those delivered in English? In order to study that, we employed letterbox another corpus analysis tool, and the beauty of it is that it helps us to visualize kind of color plates on the left and right, and then you can look at certain kind of like word clouds circling around the central word that are understudied. So if we use the same kind of statistical criteria, and if we study, however, in both interpreter speech and also politician speech, we find out that interpreter speech in particular, however, seems to attract more varieties of lexical items associated with it, whilst in politician speech, however, itself attracted a lower level of variety of words. And this is actually, if we go back to the previous slide, then we will be able to see why in politician speech there is a lower level of lexical variety as compared to the interpreted speech itself. And of course, we need to zoom in to see the actual instances of however it's used in all of the data. I will skip the technical part of it because that may be more time consuming. But I will try to unpack the finding later. Again, a similar pattern of the attraction to varieties of colloquies appear in interpreter speech and in native speaker speech in the case of but. And then That's why I named the presentation title into button buts, because in one extreme case, which is listed here, so for the heavy annotation of the data here, but we see but is associated with a lot of interruption. You see interruption, inaudible interruption, order, there'll be. So this is an actual scenario, but that's what's happening after the very usage of but. But on the left of but, you see the repetition of but of 3 times already. So basically, the very wording of but has been repeated for 4 times in total. So this is a very extreme case of how but has been used. And of course, there are other cases of the usage of but. Let's unpack the finding a little bit further here. To answer research question number 2, we looked at how but has been used as far as frequency is concerned and also word case are concerned. We find out there seems to be certain shared consensus of the usage of the CMs between interpreters and politicians. Basically, interpreters tend to use more various case when they're applying the usage of those, however, and but as compared to politicians. The study supports and adds new dimensions to the linguistic function of the 2 CMs detailed in previous research. More importantly, but was found to be strongly associated, if we look into the words associated with but, then we see but was found to be strongly associated with the introduction of exclusive or additional factors, often triggered by some easy factors. So if you say something easy, it's easy for you to use but, less offensive. In both interpreter and politician speeches in English, which might be more relevant to the phenomena of expectation. So basically, if you have something easy, not so difficult to deal with, then it's just to place it in but setting. Previous research suggested that, however, usually indicates concession, closing of a topic like more substantive usage. But in this study, both politicians and interpreters tend to associate, however, with the counting of years. The contrast of what the speaker did in comparison to others and in negation of things. Much stronger sense attached to the very usage of however. Again, it suggests a certain kind of mitigation to a certain level, but most importantly, there is a possible stronger shade of meaning of but and however as compared to the original research. And this appears in both politician and interpreter speeches to emphasize the representativeness of the language itself, of the political discourse itself, and of the very speech they stand for. So what may be more interesting is that we find a general tendency of enabling more explicit functions of the 2 CMs inclusive speeches either by politicians or interpreters. This is our tentative summary here. But you may say, you talked about mitigation. How come we're talking about explicit function, explicitness here? But what we're mentioning is actually 2 layers. So layer number 1, mitigating CMs by underusing a strong CM and overusing a more subtle CM remains a possible strategy or norm by interpreters instead of politicians. But more importantly, there still seems to be a general tendency for politicians and interpreters to explicitate the functions of the CMs under the 2 possible institutional constraints. Politicians under the representativeness constraint and interpreters under the time constraint, which are entirely different. So mitigation still exists, but what is important when we talk about explicitness, we're talking about the explicit function of the usage of the CMs. Are you with me? Yeah, so we make it clearer. So the very explicitness of interpreting itself, interpreting per se, still exists. But what is important is that when you're making choices between the 2 CMs, you choose a sacred term to use. But the function of the CMs are exaggerated, if I can use that word to help you understand it, in both politician and interpreter speeches. But for different reasons. Because for political speech, politician speech, we're talking about representativeness. They represent the discourse of the nation of the government. But for interpreters, because they are under the time constraint, they can only resort to the explicit expression of the terms used. Of course, those are just hypotheses made at this stage, and we have to really closely read and annotate each of the CM in its own context, which may be the next step that we hope to be able to carry out following this one. Do we have any questions so far? So if we move on to the kind of differences identified in the top case of the two CMs, we can find very interesting findings again. However, again, was found to feature explicitly very often is prescribed the primary function of concession in interpreted speeches, where its usage by politicians may tend to indicate strong wills which may be associated with the rhetoric of advocacy in political speeches, policy speeches. So this goes back to politician talk using the CN for the sake of representativeness and interpreters using the CN for the explicit function, mainly due to the factor of time constraints. However, Track's discussion of general topics such as market, environment, and housing in interpreter speeches, and perhaps more sensitive topics such as tax in politician speeches. So politicians are more daring as compared to interpreters again in this case. So this, again, provides possible further proof. Again, we go to the first layer. Mitigation constitutes a possible interpreting strategy in political settings. The case of but has attracted mixed semantic prosody as suggested by its helpful case such as time, which is neutral, wealth is positive, and consent, which is negative. They were shown in the interpreter speeches, and then we have a more neutral prosody as suggested by its direct pronouns as men as in politician speeches. So basically, when we use but, then we have strong figurines or constitutive, either more positive or negative, but when we talk about, when we study politician speeches, we find more neutral usage of prosody, semantic prosody associated with the word but. More emotions, if I can further unpack it. More sentiments and emotions are associated with the usage of but by interpreters as compared to politicians, as far as the data is concerned. So those results indicate that but may be used in more semantically, again, explicit cases by interpreters than politicians. So are you with me now? At the level of the usage, choices of usage between but and however, certain level of mitigation can be found. But when we come to the actual usage of but and however, then the CN seems to be used more explicitly by either interpreters or politicians, and especially interpreters, for different reasons as mentioned earlier. We can also find out that the fewer topical case of both CNs identified in politician speeches than in interpreter speeches suggest a more flexible language use in politician speeches delivered by native speakers. So we have the high frequency of the two CNs occurring together with these fluency markers, such as interruptions by others, pauses, and self-repair, and the extreme case I mentioned just now, 4 times repetition of but. So those kind of special and extreme cases indicate that politician speeches may be delivered in a more competitive arena than interpreter speeches do, because you deliver the speech, but also at the same time you have people on-spot questioning you. So this goes back to the sanction you mentioned earlier. So in dialogue mode, this has been put into a further extreme. Actually, the 4 cases of what occurred in the dialogue mode instead of the monologue mode. So again, this poses another interesting area for further exploration. Now we've reviewed answering the first and second research question. Now we move on to the differences between monologues and dialogues. Again, this is the kind of data, numbers of the data that we can see. When we compare the usage of but, we can see, again, let's look at the average frequency, which is easier to unpack here. We see in dialogue, there are more cases of however as compared to monologues. And this is exactly the same as for but the difference is much, much bigger. If we look at, again, monologues and dialogues, we look at the in the previous case, we were talking about CEPIC, interpretive language. And remember, in dialogue, we have more usage of both however and but if we look at the politician speech, the scenario is slightly different because then however is used more often in monologue as compared to dialogue. Whereas in the case of but, we have more higher frequencies of the usage of but in a dialogue as compared to monologue, which is consistent with the interpretive speech, but the usage of however is different, is opposite. So again, to unpack the finding we have spotted over there, the study presents findings to answer question number 3 regarding the frequency differences in the usage of the two CMs in interpreter and political speeches delivered in two modes, monologue and dialogue modes. A clear pattern was identified on but, which was used significantly more in dialogues than monologues by both politicians and interpreters. Again, suggesting that in dialogues, you dare to use but more often. In monologues, perhaps you are more prudent. And this is quite consistent between politicians and their interpreters. But the case related to however becomes less clear and carried no significance as far as statistics are concerned at all. So monologue speeches selected in this study involved mostly scripted speeches, and dialogues mostly included press conferences with public engagement most often, and parliamentary debates, which is the kind of conversation between the speakers of similar status. The overuse of but in dialogues may suggest a more adventurous and perhaps even more aggressive use of the CM when the audience is brought into conversation. So this actually is more consistent with the previous finding where we compare interpreter and politician talk. Whether or not this is mitigated by the interpreter is not a question, but the public engagement changed the very usage of the language itself, which has implied meaning entirely different. So now we move on to the answering of the last research question, the kind of differences in the topical case of the two CMs in policy speeches delivered in a monologue mode as compared to those delivered in a dialogue mode. Again, let me just flag through the research findings. Lanka box used again. We can see a similar pattern presented in previous slides. In monologues, however, attracted more colloquies as compared to dialogues. And we can examine them with special cases, but then we can have an opposite way of attracting colloquies suggested by the data associated with the very usage of that. So to unpack the visuals that we have seen just now, in the case of the usage of that, it is associated with positive nouns in the latter position in interpreted monologues more often, but it tends to attract more negative nouns also in the latter position in non-interpreted politician monologues. So again, you can see the different usage of but by interpreters and politicians. So interpreters tend to use but after a more positive noun, but politicians use but after a more negative noun. And what is interesting is that we can identify a mixture of both positive and negative nouns in both interpreter speeches and politician speeches delivered in dialogue mode. So what does it say? Basically, the data suggested that whereas politicians and interpreters use but more often in their rendition of policy speeches in a dialogue mode, but itself attracted a mixed semantic prosody, which may be indicated a wide variety of these contextual shifts in this communication mode. And if we look at the case of however, we find smaller and statistically less significant results, showing a close relationship of however itself with these disfluency markers again. with a strong association with the filler in policy speeches delivered by both politicians and interpreters in a dialogue mode. So what does it say? So it suggests that there is a potential of using the wording, however, as a kind of delaying strategy by both politicians and interpreters to better organize their thoughts, which is quite clever because if you think about the usage of but, it's just one syllable. However, it's much longer, then it can help you to store more time if you want to think about what is to be interpreted. So a quick suggestion, if you find difficult to do interpreting or you're guessing the kind of attitude of the original speaker, you may want to, instead of using or pauses, pass another strategy. However, in this case. To conclude the study, I believe it has been lengthy enough, provided, sorry, the type over there, rich findings relating to the use of the two CNs, but and however, in policy speeches rendered by politicians and interpreters, they may be indicative of the different constraints faced by these two types of speakers in political settings. We talked about the differences between sanction, representativeness, and also the interpreting-related constraints such as climate pressure. But again, when we unpack the data, we have to bear in our mind we have basically data coming from ritual interpreting, and the speeches are relevant to the English language itself. And the study only includes the study of the two CNs, which of course are very prominent and also very interesting in the case of CN study, especially in interpreting. But still, it is about those two CNs. But we hope that the study can provide food for thought for future study, and especially when we think about the kind of spectrum of features of political speeches situated between the possibly conflicting, yet I would like to say, possibly conflicting and yet harmoniously coexisting parameters of what we may call representativeness and sanction at the same time, or authority and acceptability. The situation, again, is further complicated by the introduction of internet and social media as a new arena, as new arenas for this particular genre of political discourse, and interpreting can add to a fourth or even fifth layer of the kind of complexity in the syntactical analysis of data, and that's why we need people to research for the interest. If you want to learn more details, here's the QR code to help you to access the full paper, and we hope that you will get a chance to understand it better after the visit.